you, Dan, for being here.
It's great to be here, and seems like a fabulous event. It's been fun to watch you from kind of the inception of this idea to something that's clearly incredibly successful. So it's really wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much. So maybe at some point, I'd love to dip into the media world a bit and talk about your previous life as running Bloomberg. But to start, so Sidewalk, founded last year, one of these alphabet companies that is backed by Google and going after the big moonshot task of reinventing and imagining cities. I want to start by talking about two things you guys have announced that you're working on, right, that I think will give people a little more sense of what Sidewalk's about. One, you may not think of it this way, but I think of it as Wi-Fi from payphone booths, which seems like a cool, like what a great idea. Why didn't someone think of that? But sort of blanketing Wi-Fi across cities, and then also focusing on the data related to transportation. So tell us about those two initiatives. Sure. and why you jumped into them.
And let me give it a little bit of a frame. So our mission, which we're pursuing through a number of different channels, is to use technology to change cities. And again, just to give you a little bit of context, if you look at the history of the modern city, there have basically been three previous technological revolutions that have created the modern city. The first was the steam engine in the early 1800s, which brought people to cities more easily. It industrialized cities. It made modern water systems and sanitation possible. The second, in the late 1800s, was the electric grid, which obviously made cities vertical. It made them 24-hour. It also made them easier to get around in. The third, which really began unfolding more than a century ago, was the automobile, which forced us to really rethink sort of the geometry of cities.
Which we're going to reinvent again.
Well, I want to get to that, yeah. Right? Which was, in effect, forced us to rethink parking, create parking, separate roadways, and also made cities easier to get out of. We have not had a revolution that has fundamentally affected cities in a century. And we believe that we are at the dawn, and it really is at the dawn of a fourth technological revolution in urban environments, and that is the digital network revolution. And we're just beginning to see the hints of it. But the reality is cities are hard, right? They're very complex organisms. You have people who have vested interests. You have politics. You have physical spaces that are now more constrained. And in each one of those previous three, we had to overcome big obstacles, but the technology ultimately cannot be stopped. And we think we're at that position now. So our mission is actually to leverage technology to produce big change in cities. So the two things that you've mentioned, the first is something called Link NYC. For those of you who live in New York, you may have seen these things. They're starting to now pop up on 3rd Avenue and 8th Avenue. I encourage you to go take a look. They're replacing every single one of the 7,500 payphones in New York City. Yes, believe it or not, there are still 7,500 payphones in New York City. Now, virtually nobody uses them as payphones anymore. They're static advertising vehicles. But if you go look at a Link, it's this 9.5-foot high structure, really elegant, I think really beautiful, that offers free 1 gigabit Wi-Fi, has public information on it. There's an Android tablet, so you can make free phone calls, video calls, fast phone charging. It gives you, it said, access to public information, immediate access to 911, 311, et cetera. We fund it all because it's a multi-$100 million investment in not only the units, but also bringing fiber to each one of these things through a very novel advertising model, which is essentially to bring the digital advertising experience into physical space. So essentially, by having access to the browsing activity of people who are using the Wi-Fi, all anonymized and aggregated.
Google or Sidewalk?
Sidewalk. We can actually then target ads to people in proximity, and then obviously over time track them through lots of different things like beacons and location services, and as well as their browsing activity. So in effect, what we're doing is replicating the digital experience in physical space. This is a complete partnership with New York City. New York City gets a revenue share. New York City has to be a partner in everything we do. They have to permit the locations. This has been through many city processes, which scares typically people away. But this is a very big opportunity. Now, if you think about it as sort of, providing free Wi-Fi and we're paying for it with advertising, that's one thing. But we actually see Link NYC, and we're now beginning the process of expanding this to other cities, as a utility. In effect, a utility that sits on the streets, which is completely fiber connected, so it's got connectivity. You're going to have 7,500 points of presence on the streets of New York. It is also a way of communicating with the public. Each one of these things has two 55-inch digital displays. And these are fountains of data about the conditions of the city, because they're also going to be equipped with environmental sensors and collecting other data, all of which can create very hyper-local information about conditions in the city. And so we see it as a utility, and so we're beginning to now apply it into other products and services, which brings me to the second product you mentioned, which is
Can I
sure.
stop for 1 second?
Sure.
So, because I think that's a great example of a project, but sort of what's the goal, right? And so is Sidewalk...
The goal for us in that case, as I said, our objective is to bring technology to solve big urban problems. In this case, the big goal is addressing digital inequality. So take New York City.
And so is it a business goal? So are you looking at investments, returns?
Absolutely. We expect to make a lot of money from this, but at the same time, we want to solve big problems. So in this case, the big problem is digital inequality. In New York City, there are 3 million people who do not have access to broadband. 3 million people. Okay? So we live in this society in which everyone's supposed to have equal opportunity. We know in today's world that without fast access to the internet, you cannot have equal opportunity. And so we are bringing literally to every neighborhood in the city, and this will be in literally all the commercial areas as well as some residential areas, fast 1 gigabit Wi-Fi. Now,
and who's providing the Wi-Fi?
We are.
We are. Okay.
Yeah. Now, and I said, if you go to 3rd Avenue or 8th Avenue, you can sign up.
Yeah.
As you travel around the city, you only have to register once, and that's it. The only thing we ask for is your email address, and that's it. So this solves this big problem. Now, again, think of these things as a utility and as something that's providing street connectivity, collecting data about what's going on the streets, and then also a way of communicating with people on the streets. And so we're deploying them now into our second product, which we call Flow. We just entered into an agreement a couple of weeks ago with the United States Department of Transportation. You may be aware that US DOT and Vulcan are actually sponsoring a $50 million competition to pick one mid-sized US city that will use that money to create sort of the so-called smart transportation system of the future. Link NYC is a core component in our new product, Flow, which aggregates data about conditions on the streets, including how it's just the traffic, what kind of traffic, how many people on the sidewalks, et cetera, upon which we and others will be able to build applications ranging from parking, lane shifting, traffic enforcement, a variety of others. And so you can, again, begin to see how this ecosystem is working.
I mean, it sounds to me, and look, I think we all know our cities need to be reimagined. It seems really hard, right? It also seems that a lot of people, stakeholders, companies, nonprofits, governments, wouldn't it just be easier to start from scratch? Wouldn't it just be easier for Google to, try and build? I mean, this is big thinking, Alphabet from scratch, and I sort of say that joking, but I also think, we can, we hear that you guys have talked to consultants about the idea that there's something in the works. So what can you tell us about that?
I can't tell you anything, but other than it would be a great idea. Not that you would change the world with one place, but the idea of bringing the future forward and being able to kind of test all of these technologies that are available today and perhaps would be over time in one place. The integration of mobility and infrastructure, the built environment, and data-driven management, even governance, social policy,
zoning,
thinking about it from the internet up, right, is really compelling. And the ability to show the way to others is a really compelling idea. In fact, even the White House has suggested that's a great idea. They just did a report of their Presidential Commission on Advanced Science and Technology, which actually recommends the idea of districts, urban innovation districts. Sometimes the problem with the idea is a lot of people have tried it, and no one's ever succeeded. And
what's going to make you guys successful?
I didn't say anything about it. Right now we're just building products and services. But I think there are lots of lessons that can be learned from the past, and we'll see what happens over time.
Okay, stay tuned. And so you talked a little bit. Let's get into some of what has held back these very initiatives. I know you've looked at a lot of cities that have tried this in South Korea and other places. I mean, from where you sit.
So I think the biggest thing, and this is, I'd be curious what people in this audience think, the biggest thing is there's a huge canyon that separates what I would call the two crucial types of players that'll have to integrate technology into cities. And they are, not surprising, the technologists and what I'd call the urbanists, the people who plan, run, care about, talk about cities. Those two groups of people basically speak completely different languages. I mean, literally do not talk to each other. Now we're starting to see very early signs of bridges being built. But it's
what's I mean, to me, it seems like one of the things that would build a bridge is like revenue or a business, right? So with Link NYC, cities are making money.
So this is the interesting thing about cities, is cities follow success in other cities. So I don't know if people know this, but before going to Bloomberg as the CEO of Bloomberg, I was the deputy mayor of New York. I was the deputy mayor of New York.
I think people know that.
But just in case, for the 6 years after 9/11, right? So for the first 6 years of the Bloomberg administration, one of the things that we did, which has been really successful, is take the High Line. How many people have been on the High Line in this room? Pretty much everybody, most people. So the High Line used to be an abandoned freight line. I mean, literally for decades it was abandoned. And it was just about to be torn down. Working with some private sector partners, we saved it, we turned it into a park. And arguably, it is the most successful new park developed in the world in decades. 7 million people walked on the High Line last year. So why I'm telling you this is because within a year after we opened the High Line and it was clear it was popular and successful, there were 36 High Lines that were under development around the world. Similar story can be told about bike share. Paris introduces at least the first kind of generally aware, kind of recognized bike share system. There's hundreds of them around. So the thing that ultimately enables cities to overcome the bureaucratic inertia, the lack of technology understanding, the fact that in many cases there isn't venture capital focused on cities because venture capitalists don't like anything to stand in the way of the product and the actual making of money, and the city is a big obstacle.
Call it friction.
It's friction. It's a lot of friction. The best antidote to that is success in another place. And so the idea of trying things in one place and being successful, and I think in most of these cases demonstrating from the private sector side, there's a valid commercial model, and from the public sector side that there's actually a path forward. Having negotiated the franchise agreement, understanding the privacy policy, dealing with local communities in a systematized way. Once you've actually done that once in one place, just like any kind of deal, it's 10 times easier the second time. Mm-hmm. And so somebody has to be a trailblazer, and that's kind of what we see our mission. If you were to look at our team, our CTO came from Google, intensely interested in cities, but I also have on our team the guy working for me who was the developer of Plan YC, which is the city's path-breaking sustainability plan. And watching sort of these two disciplines grow just internally together and build that bridge is what has to happen more globally.
So why is an alphabet company? I mean, I'm sure this is obviously a passion of yours. You could have approached this challenge in lots of ways. I mean, what are the benefits and maybe the trade-offs of being part of the Alphabet Google empire?
Look, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Alphabet/Google may be the single most ambitious company that has ever existed. And I defy anyone to come up with another. You have to go back to like the 17th century, or maybe before that, with the Dutch East India Company that
I actually just thought about that.
That actually had the power to wage war.
Yeah.
But beyond that, Google's, and the scale of the resources that they have, and I don't just mean money, I mean intellectual curiosity and then technology.
But they have their own business objectives too, right?
Well, but we think in our case we can be very logical extensions for many cases of those businesses that they have. So, we've worked very closely with Access, which is fiber. We have worked very closely with Maps. We have worked closely with Waze. They've got a series of energy things that are obviously very relevant to us. To some extent for Google, the next frontier is in the urban environment. There's a pretty famous economist named Robert Gordon who just wrote a book about how the age of progress is over. That the American progress, sort of the growth expectations that we've had literally since the 19th century are kind of coming to an end. He talks about how productivity, despite the information age, despite the internet, despite computers, has been dramatically lower since 1970 than it was in, say, the previous century. And the statistics are true. The question is, why has that happened, despite these incredible advances that pretty much everyone in this room is a part of? And I think it's very arguable, and I think history suggests it's not till you actually integrate the technology into the physical environment that you actually begin to see the kind of growth that we think is necessary to, in some ways, revive the American dream. And so I think Google sees exactly the same thing, that the logical frontier is the aggregations of people, and where that happens most efficiently and most interestingly is in the city.
And why, it's been for probably at least 5 years or more, Google and others have been reinventing the electric grid. I mean, I think Google's probably had 6 different smart grid projects that have come and gone too. And so, I mean, what is it that gives you the sense that Sidewalk and Google can be successful? I mean, at this, and it's part timing, but it seems like a lot of
for us, part of it is picking our spots carefully, right, where we can win, and then over time, as you begin to see with Link NYC and now Flow, we think there's going to be connections among them, and over time, we'll be developing relationships with cities and other policymakers. So this doesn't happen easy. Again, if you look back to the steam engine, the electric grid, and the automobile, they weren't quick things, right? The electric grid was introduced first in 1882. It wasn't until the 1920s that most people in cities were actually, electrified. The automobile was first introduced in the late 1800s. Had mass production starting in the 1910s, and it still took another generation for it to be almost completely accepted and adopted. And by the way, you go back to the steam engine, which took time. Things take a long time when you integrate them into the physical environment. So
where are we in the?
I think we're in the really early stages where we're just beginning to see the combinatorial effects of this whole set of technologies. So ubiquitous connectivity, incredible computing power, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, the ability to display data, sensing, including cameras and location data, as well as other kinds of specialized sensors. We're just beginning to see the impacts of robotics and 3D printing on design and fabrication. And we're starting to see the combinatorial effects of them play in cities. Uber, Airbnb being 2 great examples. They both essentially avoided government. For the most part, you can't avoid government. But to deal with government, you actually have to understand government. And that is where I think I and our team, kind of working with the group of our technology team, I think can be pretty unique. Government's hard. I mean, it really is. I always used to say in government that in order to be successful in government, you have to operate on 2 speeds at the same time. And that's not easy for people to do. The first is you have to be patient because everything has process. Right? There's a million constituencies that have to be touched at any one moment, whether that's the legislators, the local community group, the labor unions, the bureaucracy, and there might be many different agencies at multiple governmental levels. There's process to that. At the same time, if you don't act with a sense of urgency at all times,
have so much time
everything dies of its own weight. And so finding that kind of capability to operate at 2 speeds at the same time and do it around a set of products and services is an art. It is not a cookie cutter type approach. And that is why, for the most part, we haven't yet seen it. But it'll happen because it's always happened.
One more question from me, and then if you guys want to line up, we'll probably just have time for 1 or 2 quick questions, but feel free to start lining up. So we've got a lot of entrepreneurs and investors in the audience. What opportunities do you see for them in terms of building businesses to help drive this forward? Like, what would you be interested in investing in, or do you want to see exist that you just don't see?
Well, I said, first of all, we don't view ourselves as an investment firm. We see ourselves as a company. We see ourselves to some extent as an ecosystem.
But you do some investments, right?
Only where it advances another. We don't want to have a portfolio of investments. If there is access to a technology or access to people that we think are needed to achieve a broader objective, then we will consider it. But we don't think of ourselves as an investment firm. I think what you will see over time is a much more integrated, much more kind of holistic ecosystem. But I think there's opportunities all over the place, but they're generally going to require some degree of patience. as I mentioned, if you think about mobility, you think about infrastructure, you think about data-driven management, think about building types and forms. We think there's lots of different opportunities, and you'll begin to see us do, several new things a year that, again, increasingly kind of come into some degree of harmony.
Great. And welcome. Fire away.
Fire away?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for coming. Really interesting stuff. As everything you're doing takes root, it implies that we'll all be more interconnected and therefore more exposed. Somewhere along the line, the issues of security and privacy become challenges and opportunities for you. Are you thinking about that yet? Or
Oh yeah,
is
we
that down the
have
road?
to. We have to think about it even with Link NYC, where we, as I indicated, have agreed with New York City on a privacy policy. So said everything's aggregated, everything's anonymized. This is only going to get much more complicated. By the way, this isn't a problem just in terms of dealing with cities. This is a problem we're living with everywhere, right? I would argue that the issue of privacy and its evil twin security will be among the couple defining issues of the next generation, not just in the tech world, but for society at large. And right now we are grappling with it in a ham-handed, inconsistent, jurisdictional fighting manner that ultimately is chaotic, right? It's a great, San Bernardino is a great example of that.
What would be better? So how?
Well, it's interesting, you mentioned this idea, if you could actually create a place, that would be really interesting as a laboratory to experiment with these problems. And that's just one idea that you raised. Mm-hmm. But, I think we're going to have to wrestle with these problems in a way that is far more systematic than we have thus far. And that, because if we don't, not only will we limit progress, but we'll make San Bernardino and Apple look like nothing.
Great. Thank you, sir. We're out of time. But
Great.
this
Thank
is
you so much.
exciting,
It's great to be here.
We're really excited to watch it.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.